So my presentation is on the Bergen and Belsen concentration camp. Its creation, according to Michael Birnbaum, the author of Bergen-Belsen and the Jewish Virtual Library. It was established in 1943 on part of a previous prisoner of war camp. The prisoner of war camp was built in 1940 originally, and it held French and Belgian prisoners. In 1941, it was renamed Stalag 311, and then in 1943, it was renamed Bergen-Belsen and made into a concentration camp. The prisoner of war camp had around 20,000 prisoners. So the new Bergen and Belsen camp was designed for 10,000 prisoners, and then soon before the liberation, a couple weeks before the liberation, a second camp was opened that was just like camp number 2. The location of the camp was about 10 miles north of Seelie, Germany, and that was the city that it was closest to, the biggest city that it was closest to. So here's the camp right there, and then that's Seelie, which is about 10 miles right there, and then that's Bergen and Belsen. And the camp was originally meant, according to the Jewish Virtual Library, as a detention camp for exchangeable Jews. So Jews with foreign passports were kept there to be exchanged for German nationals imprisoned abroad. They exchanged 200 Jews to Palestine, 1,500 Hungarian Jews to Switzerland. So not a ton were actually exchanged, but it did happen. And this all took place under the rubric of exchanges for German nationals, which kind of just outlined everything. So there was 8 sections in this camp. Under the original or full name of Bergen-Belsen, there was the residence camp and the prisoners camp. In the residence camp, there was the specials camp, the neutrals camp, the Hungarian camp, and the star camp. Under the prisoners camp, there was the detention camp, the tent camp, and then there was 2 women's camps. Because as more people came, there was a huge influx of the number of women at the camp. So the conditions of Bergen and Belsen, according to the Jewish Virtual Library, it was considered a pretty good concentration camp condition standards until the spring of 1944. Evacuees from Auschwitz were sent there along with other camps from the east, and the prisoner of war camp eventually even had to be turned into a women's camp because of the increase of people. But there was not any forced labor here, which was a pretty good thing. And it wasn't until 1944 spring that it started going downhill really fast, because in March of that year, it was redesignated as a recovery camp. So people that were too sick to work at other camps were brought there. That brought a lot of disease to that camp, and they didn't receive any actual medical care, so that did not help things. And then when the Germans were retreating from the Allies, concentration camps in the east had to be evacuated, and a lot of those evacuees went to Bergen and Belsen, which continued to crowd it, which ended up having 6 times the number of people that what the camp was made for. There was 60,000 instead of 10,000 people there, and that made that the water and sanitation and food systems broke down because they couldn't accommodate all the people, and this caused a huge disease outbreak and a typhus epidemic that caused a lot of deaths. So the deaths that people had, according to the Holocaust Encyclopedia, there was actually no gas chambers here, but that definitely didn't stop the number of deaths that there were. An estimated 50,000 people died of starvation, overwork, disease, brutality, and medical experiments. These people were Jews, political prisoners, prisoners of war, Roma, gypsies, asocials, criminals, Jehovah's Witnesses, and homosexuals. So basically anybody they thought that was going to taint their race and wasn't good enough to be in their society, they put in these camps. Liberation. According to the Jewish Virtual Library, liberation occurred on April 15th of 1945. They was liberated by the British Royal Armoury Artillery 63rd Anti-Tank, and they arrested Joseph Kramer, which was the camp's commandant, And he was also known as the Beast of Belsen because of all of the awful things he did and all of the awful things he'd let happen. And he was actually taken and tried and then hung along with 11 of the other staff members that were sentenced to death, and 19 of the staff members were sentenced to prison terms. This was like the first major camp to be liberated by the Allies, and it received a lot of media coverage, and it was the first time that a lot of people had heard about all of the awful things happening in the Holocaust, and it made the situation really real to a lot of people. So the aftermath, according to the Jewish Virtual Library, 500 people died per day after because of disease or starvation, and there were 60,000 at the time of liberation, but that dropped by 14,000 that died after the liberation occurred. So they had to make mass graves to bury all these people, and at first they had SS officers carry the bodies, but there were so many that died that they had to use bulldozers, as shown in the picture, to take the bodies. The evacuation of the camp began on April 21st, and after the buildings were evacuated, they were all burnt to prevent the spread of diseases that were running rampant in the camp. And after they evacuated, the largest displacement persons camp was formed, and a lot of good things actually happened here. So they searched for relatives of the people, and they also provided religious rehabilitation. And there was actually 20 marriages a day for a while after the camp was liberated, so that was pretty cool. And 2,000 children were born to survivors. And by 1951, the DP camp was entirely empty, so everybody had migrated and moved on. So the story of the train, according to Joseph A. Pollack, writer of The Lost Transport. A week before the liberation of the camp, part of the camp was to be sent to Thimonstadt, and the first train left on April 6th of 1945 with 2,500 prisoners, and then on April 13th it was liberated by Americans. The second train was mostly Hungarian Jews, and they actually made it to their destination, but the third train that left on April 9th that had 2,500 people dropped off the face of the earth, and it was known as the Lost Train. They didn't know where it went, and they actually found out much later that it had gone into a forest way east and stopped and been liberated by Russians, and they fewer than 2,000 had remained alive on that train out of the original 2,500. And so this is just kind of one of the big mysteries that had occurred there. Like, they were like, where did these 2,500 people just like disappear to? The train was just gone. They didn't have any idea where it went, and they only learned later of what had actually happened. So just some interesting facts according to Bergen-Belsen. 600 children survived the Bergen-Belsen camp, which was actually more than any other camp at the time. And then Anne Frank also died of typhus here in March of 1945. And she was a girl who had written about her time in an annex and is just a well-known name. And after the liberation, people were super hopeful about life and felt relief, and they actually sang. So this is a video of them singing.